All right, in the last video, I talked about how I typically plan my software projects or like my small little web applications. And I usually start with diagrams that help me visualize what the user is going to do in the system and how the system kind of reacts to the user's actions. So I figured I would start to try to implement some of this logic using test-driven development and see how well we do. This is going to be a live coding session, so I don't really have much planned other than a small little project already kind of set up with TypeScript. So we're going to be doing this flow where a user kind of can click on a button on a UI, and that button is going to do a post request to an endpoint to basically vote on a thumbnail. And that endpoint is going to basically take that ID of the thumbnail and move it from one directory to either a good directory or a bad directory. And then after that's going to return a 200 status code, and then my UI is going to refresh. So I'm going to try to do all this just using Express. We're not going to use Mongo. We're not going to use like React. We're just going to use Express and hopefully use like a templating language like Pug or something to do this. But I would like to focus on test-driven development. So the first thing I want to do is let's write a function that does this logic, number 3. So basically you give it an ID and it moves that file to either one directory or another directory. So that should be pretty straightforward if you're a beginner. So let's start with that. Let's just make this real simple. I'm going to make a source folder, and inside that source folder, I'm going to make another file called thumbnailmover.js. Before we start implementing anything in here, again, this is supposed to be like a test-driven development video. So you want to write a test first. And notice that I'm not even writing the Express stuff. I haven't even imported Express, but I can still start writing functionality and testing the inner subcomponents of what I think I need to do using test-driven development. So I'm going to also make another file called thumbnailmover.test.js. And inside of this file, I am using TypeScript, so I'm going to rename all this to TypeScript. But don't worry, if you don't know TypeScript, it's really not that much different than JavaScript. All right, so we have a test file. I'm going to go ahead and put a describe block. And I'm going to say I'm going to be testing the thumbnail mover here. And that's going to have a couple of it statements inside of it, and we are going to kind of write our tests inside this it statement. So if you don't know how Jest works, typically you write a describe block and you put the thing that you're trying to test. So either the component name or the file name, you put it in the describe block, and then inside these it statements you put the actual like test scenario you want to verify. So in this case, we're going to say if given a image ID and an argument of good, move the image to a good directory. Okay, so it's a little bit verbose. The more verbose you can make the test case title, I think it's good. So if I give this thing, this function or class, whatever I decide to make this, an image ID and an argument of good, move the image to a good directory. Okay, and I can condense this if I want to, but let's just go ahead and start trying to write out some functionality. So before we even look at the implementation, remember this file is completely empty. We can actually try to figure out what the method signature needs to be here. So I could say, let's just pretend that we need to call a function. And off the bat, since we're dealing with I/O, I'm going to say it's an asynchronous function. So I'm going to say await here, and I'm going to call thumbnail mover. And make sure you also put async here. All right. So we're going to call a function called thumbnail mover, and I need to give it an image ID, and I need to give it is good. Right, so that's pretty simple. And then we can also declare these up here. So I'll say it's good, and I'll say const image ID is equal to my image.jpg or something like that. All right, so now we actually have a test that's describing what the function needs to look like. This is the function signature. And what we can actually do is we can use this signature to start implementing something. But before we do that, remember in test-driven development, you need to have a failing test. So we need some type of describe statement to verify if this is doing what it needs to do. So we kind of have a test case right now, but we don't have an expect statement, right? So it's not a test unless you expect something to happen. But we know that we need to kind of deal with file systems. So what I could do is I could basically import FS here and start dealing with the file system that's built into Node. But then I have to know about implementation detail before I even written my test, which doesn't really make sense. So what you could do is pass in another argument here using like dependency inversion. So I could pass in nodes fs right here and mock it out or spy on it to make sure certain things are called. But I like to also encapsulate fs because that is a underlying node library. So what I would do instead is just make another function called like file mover, and that could just be a jest.function, okay? And basically I'm going to pass that into, I'm going to pass that into our function as well. So again, this might be a little bit confusing because we don't even have an implementation. I'm also going to wrap this whole thing in an object because that is kind of how I like to write my functions. I don't like doing just a comma delimited list. I like named objects passing in. And what we need to do is expect that when we call this method with an image ID and is good, it should have called file mover. Expect file mover to be called. All right, so as simple as that. And we can come in through here and make this more robust in a second, but we have a test. I think if we run this, it would fail because we obviously don't have a signature. So let's go ahead and go into this file here and make a signature. So I'm going to say export const this, and I want to make sure that I also have that same signature set up. And right now I'll just return null, but okay, so now I think what we can do is we can run this test after we import this file mover. And I'm going to go ahead and do that and show you that this test should hopefully fail because we haven't actually done anything with the file mover we're passed in. Okay, so this test is failing. We have a failing test. It's saying it expected file mover to be called, and it was never called. So what we can do now is go back to the implementation and try to write a passing test. But if you want to get more robust here, because this could be called with anything and it could be wrong, you can say to be called with, I think I haven't used called with that much, but I believe I can give it like some arguments and that'll kind of be like the directories. So I'm going to say images slash backlog, and then we can say dot images slash good. How about that? Let's try to see what happens if we run this. I think this is how you use called with. Okay, so now we're pretending that there's a function called file mover, which takes in two arguments, the source directory and the destination location or something. And it's basically going to take this file and move it from here to here. In fact, I should probably do something like this. I need to verify that it's calling the right, passing the right image. Again, just a heads up, this is a live coding, so again, I don't have like the perfect solution in my head. I'm just kind of going with what I think might work good. And I think this would be a better approach. Okay. So now what we can do is we can go back to our test and we can start implementing some logic. So we can say, instead of returning null, we can say if is good, do something else, do something else. And then inside of here, we can say await file mover, and we need to basically pass in images slash backlog slash image ID. And we need to make sure that we move this image to a good folder. All right, so let's go ahead and run this and see if we get a passing test now. And we do, the test is passing. And just remember that we haven't implemented what file mover actually does, but we can do that in a second. But let's go back to our test and write another failing test because there is another case that we need to cover. There is a is bad case, right? So I'm going to copy this whole statement, paste it in and say if given an image ID, let me fix this, and an argument of bad, move the image to a bad directory, okay? So this test is very similar, but instead of is good, we're going to say is good is false. And this should hopefully move it to a bad folder directory. So the test is pretty straightforward, just like the other one. Run it, make sure it fails. And it does, because it's saying that it was not called with the correct arguments. And we can go back and implement this logic here and just basically say, make sure you move the image to the bad folder. All right, so now that we actually have in working implementation, and we have a working test as well, we can start refactoring this to make it a little bit cleaner, because right now this code looks a little bit redundant. So I'm going to say const source image location is equal to this. And I can go ahead and pass that in. And then I can also say destination location is going to be equal to is good. And then I could say good or bad. So just do like a little ternary operator here. And then we could simply just call file mover with those things. All right, so if this works, we should get 2 passing tests. So we refactor the code. It looks a little bit cleaner. I don't know if you can consider this clean. So I think I'm going to say destination rating like this. I'll just say rating. How about that? So you can kind of dynamically change the rating if you want to. I'm going to put this in here and let's run it one more time to make sure our test is passing. Okay, so again, anytime that you have like conditional logic, you have different branches in your code, you want to make sure you test both of those branches. And there is a way in Jest to show your code coverage if you want to get down that path, but I'm just going to keep it pretty simple. So now we have an actual like function that should hopefully move images from one directory to another. Again, we have to implement this file mover thing. We haven't implemented this yet, but we could technically just do that real quick. So I'm going to make another file called filemover.js, or sorry, not JS, TypeScript. And we are going to make a filemover.test.typescript. So this one, we probably don't need to test as heavily because underneath the scene, we're just going to be using like Node's file system. So I'm going to say file mover. Again, try to do some more test-driven development. We're going to have an if statement says should invoke, should try to move a file using Node's fs. All right, so let's pretend we have a file mover and we want to basically call it with the same function or the same files. So I'm going to call file mover. I'm going to do an await on it just like we did before. And this is going to be a very similar test to the one that we did previously. But we are going to basically give it a location like a.jpg. We'll say source a.jpg, and then we're going to call, what am I doing? Destination a.jpg. All right, so if I call this, I should expect that it tried to call Node's file system. So again, you can kind of do dependency inversion if you wanted to. I might just actually just do a jest mock here. So let's just pretend that this thing has to use Node's file system. So I think up here I can say jest.mock. And then inside of this describe, what I'm going to do is just before each of these tests, I want to mock out fs dot. Oops, how do they do this? Oh, you got to import it first. Okay, so they import the library like this. So I can import fs from here. As you can tell, I don't really use this mock function too often. So you can import this, and then I can say fs.rename.mock implementation. And I believe this function actually needs to have a callback passed in. So I could say like source, destination, and then callback. And really what we want to do is just invoke the callback here. Actually, let me see if Node has a rename sync. They do. I'm going to say rename sync instead. Rename sync. And I'm going to say mock return value. Or yeah, I'm going to do mock implementation. And I'm just going to have it do nothing basically. Now I am using TypeScript, so it's complaining about some stuff here. I had to add this because TypeScript doesn't know how to like do this stuff. So I had to do this kind of hacky, rename this method as a mock, and then I can call mock implementation. But basically what I'm doing is I'm saying anytime someone calls fs rename sync, I can actually spy on it as called and verify some things. So I'm going to call file mover, and I want to verify that rename sync was called. So expect to be called. Let's see if this test actually runs. Again, we don't have file mover defined. So I'm going to go ahead and say export const file mover, and that needs to be source and destination. And what that can do is for right now, do absolutely nothing. Let's run the test suite and see what happens. Let me run the actual write test here. Unexpected token. So first of all, I did not import file mover, and then I believe I have an extra, I got something extra going on over here. I'm missing a parenthesis here. Let's try running it again, see what happens. So it's saying that it should have been called, but it was never called. So let's try doing something with this. And what we could do is import it here. So I'm going to say const fs, or say import fs from file system. And then I can say fs.rename sync source and destination. And I think that should hopefully make the test pass, because now we're actually verifying that it's called. So that works. And I would like to refactor this a little bit more to say was called with. And this could be a little bit, let's rename this. So I'm going to say source is this, const destination is this. So it should be called with source and destination. So let's see what happens if we just refactor this a little bit and we verify that this is called with the right stuff. Cool. So it seems like it's being passed. I want to make sure that if I break something, that the test fails. So I'm just going to put like a hard-coded string here, and the test should hopefully fail. Yep, looking good. So at this point, you might be like, Cody, this was a lot of extra work just to get the whole idea of using Node's file system out of this. And it was, but the whole idea is that now this is not coupled to Node's file system. You can bring in a third-party library that does better file I/O, and this doesn't have to care about it, because all you need to do is just pass in whatever interface or whatever function can be used for moving a file. That could be Node's file system, that could be any npm package that you find online, that could be a custom implementation, and you don't worry about having this coupled to Node. Is this a good approach? You can argue that it's, I don't know, over-engineering, but I think it's cleaner because it's easier to test, it's easier to understand what's going on, but you have to type out a little bit more code. So we wrote 2 files, we wrote 2 functions, and we have those tested. We tested those with test-driven development. Let's actually verify that some of this stuff works, because I'm going to wrap up this video in just a second. So what I want to do is just make a quick little index.ts file, and I'm going to import the thumbnail mover from the thumbnail mover file, and we're just going to go ahead and call it, and we're going to pass it those 3 things. So I'm going to say image ID is equal to testing.png, and then is good is true, and then we need to have a file mover set up. So I'm going to say file mover is equal to, right now I'm going to basically say file mover. We could import that from the top. Let me go ahead and import that like this. All right, so hopefully if I run this function, what should happen? And I'm going to make this, I think this should be a promise chain. So I'm going to say then console.log hello. I just want to make sure it prints out hello if everything's good. So what we can do here is we need to make sure we have a directory set up. And I think it needs to be set up in the source folder, but we can kind of change that in a little bit. We need to have an images, and we need to also have a good folder. We need to have a bad folder, and then we also need to have a backlog. And then inside that backlog, I'm going to make a file called testing.png, because that is what we're kind of verifying in this. So I'm actually running the real implementation here, and technically you could start writing like an integration test if you wanted to, but I'm going to say mpx ts node, and I'm going to say source of index.ts and see what happens. So what this should do, fail, because it's complaining about a lot of TypeScript stuff. So what I need to do is go back to my TypeScript. This needs to be a function. I just need to add types to all these things. Image ID is a string, and then is good is a Boolean. I think this is all I need to do. Okay, this needs to be a string as well. Let's just go ahead and add those in. And let's see what happens if it makes any progress. It's still complaining about some stuff. I don't know why it's complaining about these. Cannot find name image ID. It's right here. This is sometimes why I do not like using TypeScript. I know TypeScript is better when you have a larger team, but I don't know. What I'm going to try doing instead is just say thumbnail mover args. I'm going to make this an interface. So sometimes when you need to like declare the types of some things, you'd have to basically do something like this. And then I'm going to say options, and that is going to be a type thumbnail mover. And again, I'm a TypeScript noob, so I think I might be able to do something like this, hopefully. If anyone knows and is watching, like, let me know what's going on here. But let me just do this. I think I'm making this too complicated. I'm just going to say options.image.id, options.image.id, options.isGood, and then options.filemover. This might have been overkill. Let me try doing this. I'm going to run this and see what happens. So it's saying no such file or directory. Rename images backlog testing. Now I think testing that PNG images good. I think this actually needs to be pulled up one level. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull this out to the top level and see if this works again. All right, so you see here it moved that file into the good directory, and I can also add like another bad.png or hello.png. And I could simply say, I'm going to rerun this file and say hello.png, and I'm going to say as good as bad. All right, so that was a lot of extra overhead just to get this working, but oh, this needs to be false. What am I doing? All right, so it moved the file from the backlog to bad, and also we saw that it moved the file from backlog to good, depending on what you pass for true and false. Well, hopefully this tutorial helped you kind of understand how to do test-driven development using TypeScript in Node. We're going to continue on building onto this by bringing in Express and building an API endpoint. But for right now, let's just keep this a shorter video. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Also, leave a comment below if you have a different way that you'd like to do testing or test-driven development. And then also be sure to subscribe if you're new to this channel, because I'm going to have other videos like this that should hopefully help you become a better web developer in the future.